30 this year. Sorry. And for those of you who've not been here before, the spirit of dialogues is obviously to bring a varied group of people together and listen to and then discuss and debate not just architecture but publications, authors of books this evening, but overlapping with architecture, but historians, all sorts of people. If you hadn't previously been here and you'd like to come again, just make sure you have your email address and you become part of the Dialogues community. Now, Anna and Mike, I don't think they do need a huge amount of introduction. Mike was actually giving a talk about Le Corbusier last night for Docomomo, and I introduced him at some length. I think their work is extraordinary and pretty unique, if not absolutely. Work is unique. But it is unique in our peers, in our country, in our time. It is really quite extraordinary and quite unusual. And your background in landscape architecture, engineering, all sorts of things, the breadth of as a cultural reach that you bring, and the methodology. I think all I was going to say, which I think is really extraordinary, is that you've taken on in publishing this book something which most architects can rarely explain, which is what they do and how they do it. It's tacit knowledge, and it's really extraordinary that you're able to articulate something pedagogically which so few can. So I don't really know what you're going to talk about. I've heard you talk for 6 minutes at the AA on the book. You were talking at Temple Bar, you said, for 30 minutes the other day. You might talk a bit longer, but what's really interesting is that you can articulate a process that I think so few can, even though we've all busily been doing it for years. Mike, Anna, thank you for coming here tonight.
We're going to do a bit of a kind of duet, but I'm going to start. And in a way, just to put this in context, so 25 years ago, we published a book that was called exactly the same name, Asking, Looking, Playing, Making. And this is a process that expands and contracts over time, and each stage of that process has a very specific target in what it's trying to achieve. And so 25 years later, it's been working and teaching, practice and teaching, practice, teaching and practice over all that time. And the methodology was one thing, but in that small book, there was also a kind of thing we called the creed, and that was about how we wanted everything to kind of relate to nature. So the book was quite esoteric. Actually, what I've shown you is the entire text of the book. And so when we've rewritten the book many years later, after teaching at the AA, the book got us a job teaching at the AA, and there we were kind of exploring nature very directly with the students and looking for stories. We share this process with a lot of people we do collaborations with, and I think they really enjoy using the process because it kind of brings facets out of projects by looking at nature, people and place. And we've used it in research we've done. This is a picture of a tracheal stent we designed and have a patent for, which is quite an unusual thing. So the process can be used to design almost anything. And the process was sort of taken a little bit further by my PhD, which was called a nature-focused storytelling process. So Anna is now going to show you the first stage of asking and then looking, and then I'm going to talk about playing and making.
Thank you, Simon, for having us. So in this book, aside from the process which Mike described, that one's missing. We also added 5 case studies to demonstrate how that process works. So as Simon said, it's very, very difficult to rationalize a process. And in this book, it looks maybe a little bit neat, but the realities of it is actually somewhat much more organic, and there are a lot of U-turns. And I suppose part of the motivation for doing this book is we feel architecture's really going through a very difficult patch right now with the convergence of challenges on many fronts, and sometimes we're all quite sort of inhibited in almost a culture of fear, but also we all have architectural prejudices, and it's very difficult to think outside of our own sort of limitations, and we almost forget actually architecture is an incredibly holistic and powerful tool for innovation. So we want to use this opportunity to rethink the three facets of nature, people, place from first principles. And I hope we can show you how that works. So to show the process, hi Tony. There's a seat here. We are going to use, so the first project is Singing Reed Tree, but I'm going to show you the diagrams that demonstrate the beginning process, which is asking. So the site was disparagingly described to us as nothing but wind. And in the beginning, we looked at, so asking, the first stage asking is all about words. We don't use images or not, we resist sketching because chances are when you start drawing, it's what you know already or what you're very familiar with. And we all get into habits of what we want to do. So we use words, and it's almost like a kind of word association game. And the main the main aim is to redefine the brief as a set of riddles. And I'll explain what these storytelling tools do to this process. So the brief is expanded in 3 pillars of nature, people, place. And then within each pillar, it's expanded in 4 ways. So for example, nature, we often see it as one scale or another. Here, we're looking at, in terms of geography, so the kind of natural setting of a place, the site, and the clues from everything that's non-human on the site, the geology and the biodiversity and so on. The second scale is elements, so rain, sun, and wind. So increasingly we use them as resources, but they also can be integral to our design as a sort of animator. We all are familiar with the idea of using light, but rain and wind and other senses like sound and smell and touch can also be embedded into architecture. So we very deliberately think of what are the elements that we should look at. And then symbols, so I think it's a very natural instinct to connect to nature through symbols. It's been, through so many fables and stories. So it is something that we found with our projects that help to unify the communities that we're working for, and it gives them a kind of new identity that I don't think anyone argues with nature. There's rather universal, but they could also become incredibly specific and local. And so that's the beauty of symbols that come from nature. And lastly, lessons. So structural lessons, systems nature lessons. So how nature actually works. How can you learn from observing a structure or a system in nature, and how can you then abstract those principles and apply them to your design? And you'll see some of our projects don't use that fourth one, but some directly do, and a lot of them probably use two or three. And the important thing here is the time perspective. So we're looking at what something is, which is often the problem that we have to solve as architects. What something was, maybe not so much history, but the origin of something. What was the beginning of this kind of place of gathering? And then what it could be, which is often in the client's brief, the aspiration, the big ambition. And actually we find when we look at this, we help the clients expand that aspiration even more, because it's not just about you're hoping to fix certain problems. It's also facing up to the challenges that you might have in the future. So thinking about what they are and really designing for them. Equally, people, it's not just the immediate neighbors, it's also the surrounding community, maybe the urban communities, the company who's commissioning it, and then the society, which is, I think, in a way, the greater, the larger world. We have a duty to address certain issues at this moment in time. It's almost like the collective subconscious. So it's never just about one individual, one set of group. And that's incredibly useful for when you engage with user groups and communities, to remind them to think outside of their own groups. And again, to think in time perspectives. What your community was, what it could be, and what it is now. What are the strengths and the weaknesses? And place is, I guess, directly more architectural, the type of activities and the cultural and physical clues that we get. And then once again, we expand each one in 3 time perspectives and 4 types. So this is the scenery tree, which was our first artwork project, sculpture. This is a story we wrote in the end, and the asking process yields this thing we call work cloud, but in reality it's a lot more, a lot more crowded than this. And then we have to sort of find threads. And why do we say we're looking for riddles? Because riddles are where the most interesting things are about the project. They are the contradictions of the project, which often the clients are not even aware of. So when you find the riddles, we find anyway that they give us incredibly challenging sort of goal to resolve. So it almost pulls out the best and the most kind of innovative side of what we do in design, because we have to reconcile a set of contradictory goals. And so in this case, we're talking about panopticons, a structure that's on the top of the hill, designed to look around, so the word panopticon, but it's also to be seen from the town. And so there are many interesting sort of dualities. And when you get to the looking and playing and making stage, you experiment with, we got onto the idea of sound rather than vision, and we experimented with how to turn wind into sound. So how to turn something that's really kind of despised or disliked into something different and transformative. So it's become, I think, a bit of a identity for Burnley on the top of the hill. And at one point, I remember, it went on pause for a long time. So what's not evident in the diagram in the book is that there was a long pause where the clients weren't sure, they wanted to progress and so on. And in the end, they came back and said, well, we did a flag flying contest and decided that it needed to be visible from the Sainsbury's car park in Burnley.
To get the money off Sainsbury's.
Is that a possibility? We said, oh, okay. So we knocked down a radio mast shed and propped it up on the rubble of that demolition, and managed to achieve it without building more of a sculpture. And it's become adopted by the area as
Our job was to, I said in the brief, to put Burnley on the map, and then the scenery tree was put on the map as well.
I think what's interesting, I feel it's almost implicit in every brief that a place needing regeneration or cohesion wants to be put on the map, in whatever measure. And whether you're Grosvenor Estate or a tiny village in the north of England, I think everyone wants to have a sort of voice and place on the world stage. So the second stage is looking. It's always where we set the architectural intent. And we're going to show the process through this project Swing Bridge in Crystal Palace Park. client body is a local group. The head of the group,
The Friends of Crystal Palace Dinosaurs, that's what they
Crystal Palace Dinosaurs. So they kept saying, we need a bridge, because the dinosaurs are falling apart. These are astonishingly grade 1 listed structures that are falling apart, and no one really understood, or at least I did in the beginning, the significance of this. So, so this is what it looks like in our office when we do the brainstorming. So the looking stage is now more kind of visually based. So we will look at graphs, you know, for instance, with symmetry, wind data and so on. But here, looking at similar territories, and then we put them on the wall along with the words from asking, and we try to make connections and threads that lead us to a place we call the quest, which in a way is the architectural intent. So here we took the riddles and then expanded it again through the perspectives of others. So in this case, through nature, people, place, but within each one, this is obviously could be swapped with other types of specialists. If we didn't have a mythologist, for instance, in our team, we would role play. We would think as a mythologist would, or anthropologist, and I think almost using other disciplines' tools to analyze the situation, to expand. And what we're looking for is a sort of unique and universal design intent. So what's unique to this place? And we would sit around with, say, the ecologists, and they would say, yeah, this is only applies to this place in this situation. But equally, there are similar exemplars around the world that could help substantiate what we're doing, our ambition. So you're expanding the ambition of the project, and in the end, sort of end up with this wall of inspiration that leads us to a set of quests. So in this case, it's about a mixture of economy and communicating what this place was. So we learned that the dinosaur islands were laid out in geological time. So even in the way they created the islands and planted it, it was a way to it was sort of first example of edgy entertainment, which means educational entertainment. So the Victorians wanted very much for sort of physical things to communicate certain knowledge, and so planting, geology, and then those dinosaurs to teach people about evolutionary time. So we had a choice of two sides, and we chose this one because it was the beginning of time, it was before dinosaurs. And that gave us the clue to look at kind of bony fish, and also the process of design we equated to a kind of evolution and adaptation. And in this sort of modeling of this quite short span bridge, maybe about 10 meters, we looked at different undulations to see what was the most optimal. So we maybe tested many iterations to find what was the best visual and structural result. So this gave you a certain performance. We learned from how creatures move through the water in a very efficient way, and when the forces behave this way, you can make the plates super thin. In the back of our mind, always there was economy in place, because the group was raising money from the mayor's funding and also from their local community. So how are we going to make it really cheaply? We invented this method, which is taking one sheet of metal and cutting it, laser cutting it, and bending one up to form the balustrade, keeping one straight to form the deck, and one going down to join the torsion beam. And that was a very efficient and material efficient and financially efficient way of making this. This is it in the workshop, and I think what was lovely about how the client was so determined and publicizing this project, it then attracted the attention of a local fabricator called Cake Industries, And they came forward, they approached us to say, we really want to build this project. And it was such a lovely sort of joining up of forces. And they did it through lockdown days, you know, very, very difficult times, but they made it happen. This was it arriving on site, and the kind of moment of beauty when it dropped into the pivoting mechanism that was in the water. So the third riddle, I suppose, to mention about this bridge is that it had to be a bridge, but also be a gate at some point. So because they didn't want access to the islands all the time, so we of course tested a lot of alternatives, putting gates or lockable and even quite wild options, platforms that break up and become, you know, inaccessible. And the most simple option we came up with was this idea of the pivoting bridge. So normally it's parallel to the bank when not in use, and when needed, it's just a chain in the water and you just pull it across, as like so. So I'm going to hand you over to Mike, who's going to take you through playing and making, and through 3 projects, some of which you might have seen.
So when we're playing, we're taking those quests. The quests are always varied, and they always give us a series of quests. So we're never chasing one thing, we're always chasing several things. So I'm going to kind of show you that process in the case of the Tower of Light. So the Tower of Light is a flue to an energy centre in Manchester, but that flue is at the gateway to the Civic Quarter in Manchester, and so they wanted it to be a kind of landmark. So I'm going to show you how we kind of won the competition and how we kind of got there. So the 3 quests we had were, we wanted to sort of, the idea of sort of capture the natural energy of the rotation of the Earth, because we said that all energy on Earth is involved in rotation. The rotation of the planet gives us the winds, and the changing of the seasons, and the changing of the day. And in the man-made world, rotation gives us all our engines and our wheels and our forward. So rotation and energy are very much kind of interlinked. We have a kind of preference for strength in form, so we're very concerned by making things that have strength embodied in the way they're made and the form they have, so that they're completely efficient. As you saw in the swing bridge, which actually you couldn't change anything without it becoming less efficient. And then the other thing was, Manchester was a city of chimneys, and actually our job was to reinvent the chimney, basically. So we take those quests and we start to kind of play, and we take each of these things, a setting, a mass, circulation and typology, and we balance between the poetic and the pragmatic. And this kind of comes back to what we were saying 25 years ago. It's always a balance between poetic and pragmatic. And in the office, we always make models. We make lots and lots of models. So everyone's sitting around the table, it's done communally. And then those models get improved until they kind of go into Rhino. When they go into Rhino, then we start to kind of amalgamate things, and things get selected, and we start to narrow it down. And eventually a kind of winner, they're called quests because there has to be a kind of defeat, and there has to be a kind of a victory. And the victory is the one that makes the most sense financially, artistically, and becomes an archetype, because basically we're looking for a symbol. We're looking for something that symbolises what the project's about, and we're not afraid for it to be a symbol. It's not a sign, it's a symbol. So we get to the end of, and we get an archetype. And in this case, it was the idea that we were going to make a kind of totem of energy. So to start with, this tower, it rises 40 metres off the floor, and when we went into the kind of process, it was only 4 millimetres thick, and it has no other structure. So it's an incredibly strong structure, and that's because we learn from nature. So this is one of David Attenborough's favourite things. It's a sponge. It has no brain. It's 200 million years old. It hasn't changed. It's incredibly strong. It exists at 500 metres below the sea, and small shrimps live inside it. Bamboo, 400 million years, the diaphragms in bamboo are very pivotal to the way the bamboo works and the way the forces are transferred from one side to the other. A cactus in the desert is really interesting because it points at the sun, because cactuses are generally on the equator, so the cactus can get as big as it can because it just points directly at the sun, so it stays very, very cool, and this structure helps it do that. I mean, shell-lace structure, well, that's something we invented in 2009. But we didn't think of using that straight away, to be honest. We explored all sorts of things, and like Anna said, it's a kind of messy process, but we get a series of design alternatives, and we're quite serious about chasing each one. We were really looking at rotation and how we could get rotation into a system, but actually the one that was most successful was the one where actually we put rotation into a surface and we made a single surface structure. So shell lace was something we'd kind of developed, as I said, at an exhibition at the RIBA, and it had its own kind of evolution, including the stent and other competitions we'd won. It has an efficiency to it because it has great strength in form, because when you tailor single surfaces and join them back together again, you lock in the strength. So you take a sheet, you cut the sheet, you bend the sheet, and you weld it together. And when you weld them together, they can only go in one place, and once they're there, because they have other surfaces next to them, they can't move. So the strength is locked into the surface, and that's how we could get it down as thin as 4 millimeters. And then we welded them together into a drum, and then the drum had all of the paraphernalia that was needed. So mirror polished stainless steel drums, and then all of this kind of made up a diaphragm, and these, at the bottom of these are stainless steel, gold stainless steel reflectors that are 2 millimeters. They're about the size of this, and they move in the wind. So when the wind blows, the light reflects off them, and you'll see how that works in a minute. So these are the drums being built. That's young Chris, who was the engineer from Arab, Chris Clark, and these two guys did the welding, and funnily enough, they're both called Phil. And this is the workshop, and I actually didn't see that. That was a sort of picture taken by the contractor and sent to us before they went off to painting. But you can see how they're sort of components, and the components get lighter as they go up, because as it rises, the wind speed increases, and as the wind speed increases, the bigger you make the perforation, the less the structural roll, it makes more sense. You take more of the structure away, and it makes the structure lighter. And in essence, the drums are put onto a lorry, and we designed it so that you could get 2 drums onto one lorry, and it was still fitted within the kind of, you didn't have to have road closures. And you'll see how a rotation works later. When we won the competition, they then said, that's great, but we want you to do the same thing for the energy centre itself. So actually, in a rare case, they doubled the budget, and they gave us more money to do the base of the energy centre, and they said, we want you to make a statement about energy here. So here we talked about the energy of the land, not the energy of the sky, and we showed them pictures of what are they called, camber sands, where the wind and the waves have made these beautiful patterns of energy left imprinted in the sand, and we tried to kind of replicate that. And the stainless steel tap drum was built by a company in Bolton called Shulton's, and we wanted this to be built locally, so we went directly to Darwin Terracotta, and Darwin Terracotta told us something quite interesting. They said, that company started by making Belfast sinks, and they said, if you make it the size of a Belfast sink, you'll pay less money for putting it onto the wall. If you make it the weight of a Belfast sink, 2 men can carry it, and actually that's the optimum material. And if you make it the colour of a Belfast sink, that's the cheapest glaze. So with those things, and they told us one more fact, that if you have used the mould 25 times, the mould's finished, and you need to make a remould. And we said, well, can the mould change? And they said, you can change the mould as many times as you like, as long as we can use it 25 times. So we took that amount, and there were 1,300 tiles, and we divided it around the height so that actually we could make the tiles undulate. So what we could actually do was bring that sort of camber sands undulation into the changing profile of the sand. So each one is made in a slip cast. They're then finished by hand, and then they get glazed, and then they end up on the wall. So they catch the light at night, and along here the lights move, so there's sort of movement, and also the car headlights make the building move as well. So we wanted its kind of interaction with the city. So the whole building starts to move, and here the lights are on the outside and lights are on the inside, so at night it can change too. In Pride we also change it so it's in different colours, and the Heart Foundation we change it red for the Heart Foundation. And we didn't want them to change it whether Manchester City or Manchester United had won. We said that was off the cards. It would have been blue most of the time. So this is during the day. So those gold reflectors I talked about, I'd never seen this because I've never been there when it's not raining, and even when it was finished. So the reflectors on the inside, they're catching the light's reflecting off them onto the flues that's inside. And so the light inside kind of quivers. There's a kind of gold quivering light, and that's why it's called the Tower of Light. So, making. I'm going to show you the water tower just because it's a kind of nitty-gritty project in a historical setting. Castle Acre is a really fascinating village. It's quite small, but it has 4 ruins. A Norman castle, the best one in Britain. It has a priory, which is actually really beautiful, and has a bailey gate through which you enter the village. Quite a rare thing to survive. And it has this, a steel water tower. And our friend Dennis paid 25 grand for this in auction. He was bidding against a scrap metal dealer. So that metal is worth 25 grand, or 24 grand probably. So, but Dennis paid just a grand more and got it. He then got with it some land around it, and he was adamant he wanted to live in the tank, and he told us he only had 200,000 or 300,000, so it was like, how are we going to do all of that? So anyway, there's Dennis. He's a photographer. That's Dennis inside the tank. The tank here is a kind of rusty hulk, and inside the tank the pressure of is as big as this whole room, and the pressure is enormous. When all that water in there, it's the equivalent of an 8-story building, and so the outward pressure is huge. So these rods stop it from expanding outwards, because the skin is actually quite thin. It's just a thin skin of kind of cast iron. So here's the process. I won't go into it too much, but you can see we do the poetic and pragmatic, and we did a whole series of alternatives, and it gave a series of variants until we arrive on one, and actually have to go to the kind of QS and persuade Dennis he needs to spend a little bit more money, because otherwise he has to go for some of these other options he didn't really want. And actually it made the most sense, because we kind of maximise the structure. And then when it comes to making, we take those first 4, setting, mass, circulation and typology. I'll explain that a little bit more with the York project. And then after that we go through structure, service, enclosure and apertures. And each one of those can be different in a building. And by separating the building out into those fundamental components, you can make a kind of an artistic agenda for each part of a building separately. And I'm going to explain that a bit more carefully here. So here we are, kind of family apart. So we had the kind of tank, the frame, the bridge and the stair. And I'm going to explain how each one, in our aim, was to take you closer to nature. So in the tank was always full of water. So we said, let's make a horizontal cut. Dennis wanted to cut huge windows in the side like everybody in a water tower does. And we said, no, don't do that, that's too Kevin McLeod. So let's just make a slit. And let's just make the slit so when you sit down you see the view, and when you stand up you see the view. And what you'll do is you'll just bring the horizon completely into the tank. And actually that was a much better thing to do. And we did that with the help of Mervyn Rodriguez, who was a brilliant engineer, and he said we could do it by turning the skin that was already there into a truss, just by putting a frame on the outside of it, and by using the window frames that were next to the Velfac windows to bear the structural load. So a minimal structure. So Dennis and his son, which son's that?
Not sure. Harry, I think.
Well, Harry, that's it, yeah. So with a sledgehammer in the morning, they undid the bolts and they knocked out the first panel. And by the evening, they'd gone all the way around with a sledgehammer and knocked all the panels out. And Dennis said it was a very satisfying day, absolutely exhausted. But in doing so, they kind of revealed the horizon. And that was the intent. What I pointed out to him is that actually once you make a slit like this, it's very easy for you to get glare unless you bring some light into the middle. So we persuaded them that we needed to have a skylight because that got cut out of the budget and we had to kind of put it back in, otherwise, you know, the light wouldn't be even. And what we did is we surrounded that skylight by mirrors on 4 sides, so that actually it doesn't matter where the sun is, the sun would always enter the space. And then we put a flat glass skylight on the top of it. And then Dennis made this film. This is the sky moving past, slightly speeded up in the mirrors that surround it. And at night there's a light around that as well. So that sort of balances out the light in the space. And what happens when the sun moves around the building is that light's constantly changing. And when it rains, the water lands on top of it and the light comes through the water, and you get these kind of water patterns that move throughout the building too. So environmentally, you can see that this is a sort of separate environmental zone here. We couldn't go into this structure here. So this is environmentally one zone and this is another zone. So I'm going to tell you how the tank works. So the frame is incredibly slender. These are only 150 by 150s. They're steel. We had to kind of fireproof them, and then we put the plan inside them. So we put a bedroom on each floor, and a bathroom and a bit of a wardrobe space, and on top of that a mezzanine because they were kind of like cube-like spaces, and then at the back we put the staircase. And Monsieur is from France, and in France, in northern France particularly, you see all of the staircases. In England, the staircase goes straight, and then bends around the corner and then goes straight again. In France, they weave their way around. It's much more beautiful. It's much more sort of how you move around the stair. And so we just made the stair like that. So these rooms, Dennis wanted the water tower to face south, but we pointed out that if you face it south, you would be looking at the village, but you would be he wanted to look at the sun, and we were saying, no, you don't really want to look at the sun, you want to look at what the sun's on. So we persuaded him to make the windows just point to the north, and that had several advantages. It meant that basically you had no light pollution went to the village, but actually what you did see was almost sort of 1 mile wide field of barley. This is a photograph I took on the first time we went to the site. And when you see that from the top of a water tower, and when you see the wind blow it, it's absolutely beautiful. It's like watching a kind of ocean. So we made the rooms sort of barley coloured by making it out of CLT. So you're in these CLT rooms that look out onto the barley coloured landscape. And that's what it looks like at night. And as you can see, the light pollution is just into the field, and the village is kind of behind it. And this is what the rooms are like. And there's a window, a low level on one side, a low level window on one side and a high level window on the other. And in the morning, the high level window makes a square sun on this side as the sun rises. You get a square sun arises and moves across the room, and you're looking out onto the barley field there. The skin is made of, it's not galvanised wriggly tin, it's zinc anodised wriggly tin, and it doesn't go dull. It stays super shiny, so the building kind of reflects whatever the light conditions are. And we planted Boston ivy on it, so eventually this building is going to become like the ruins down in Castle Acre. It'll kind of go back into the landscape. And there it is kind of reflecting the sun. Dennis said he was called one night by someone who thought the tower was on fire because it was reflecting back the red of the sunset, and then they realised actually it was just it reflecting the light. And maybe the most important thing is the stair. So Anna and I have travelled a lot, and one of the places we travelled was Yemen. And in Yemen, the stairs are always used as kind of thermal chimneys, and that's how they keep those buildings that are 8 stories tall. So we use the stair here as a kind of thermal chimney by having very little openings in it, and by letting in 2 doors at the bottom to let in the cold air, and it can flush the air out of the rooms as it goes up by keeping the ceilings high. So in a shell, it's called a compression spiral, when the force on a shell goes into the centre, and all of the loads are taken into the centre of a shell, and by distributing those loads, it helps the skin be really thin. So in the staircase is, it's 4 stories tall, and the wall thickness is only 80 millimetres, and we managed to do that by turning the stair into a compression spiral. So the stair is actually, each tread is made out of 2 pieces of timber, and those 2 pieces of timber are locked into the walls. So as it goes round, so it's a bit like a sort of Robert Adams stair. It's a compression spiral, and because there's 2 steps in the bottom, you get that kind of curve coming all the way up. And those bits were the offcuts from the rest of the bits, and so the pieces of timber cost £3,500. And Dennis built this project. Again, we like to do things locally. Nearly everybody who built this, he met in the pub. And this is Ben and his dad, Nigel, and they built the stair. They started on Monday morning, and they got there by Thursday evening. And so that cost £3,500 as well. So for £7,000, we built the 3 flights it took to get to the top. So it's an incredibly cost-effective way. And we reused these rods to be the balusters, and because we had loads of them, we put one on each tread, so that when the stair goes round the corner, it's like a kind of harp. It speeds up and it slows down again, and then it has a kind of a handrail like a comprehensive school. So this is the view from the distance. You see all the way through the building, and that's Dennis and Missia in the room. So you can see here we kind of told a story about the water tower, and we made a story that's very particular to Dennis being a photographer, and each one of those spaces has tried to make a different relationship with nature. So that's what's important to us. And actually, as a practice, I'd say bringing people closer to nature is our main goal. So I'm going to show you the last project, where I'm going to show you the playing and the making, and I'm going to break it down a little bit more. So this was a competition to provide a workshop, apprentice accommodation, and an administrative headquarters for the stonemasons in York. And the intention of, it's called the Centre of Excellence, the intention was to speed up the repair of the cathedral by 4 decades within a century. So it uses high-tech equipment and ancient craft skills. And we won the competition, which is this building up here, which is next to the city wall. And as a consolation prize, we got this building, which is a super high-tech shed, where all the really, really high-tech saws are. I'm not going to show you both, because it would take a little bit too long, so I'm just going to show you the quad. So, and I'm not going to tell you the whole asking, looking, playing, making process, but I'm going to show you a little bit about York. So these pictures were taken before we did the project. When you walk into a cathedral, everybody looks up, because cathedrals are about light and geometry and structure. And so for us, we wanted it to be kind of within that sort of cultural territory. York is a sort of a vertical perpendicular, so we wanted it to be an express structure. So we want this structure to be expressed, and we want it to be a sort of didactic structure where you understand what you're seeing. The other competitors, it was a stonemason, so they thought they should make it out of stone. We said no, the stone is for the cathedral. And actually, I used to work at Walcott Reclamation in Bath, and actually there the stonemasons worked in these beautiful timber sheds next to the river, and it felt to me like the timber building is the right thing. So, and York is full of timber buildings, and I think that was the right decision. And then there are a few things, if you go to any cathedral museum, you'll always find a bishop's star, and you'll always find a monstrance. A monstrance is something that you put on the altar. They put the sacrament in at Easter time, and it's kind of light emits from the kind of the sacrament. So, and in the cathedral, this is the chapter house in York, and this is one of the stained glasses. Also, this idea of kind of radial light as a sort of a metaphor of God was something we wanted to include. So, in the book, we say how you can take a building, and like we said, you can take the setting, and if you take the setting and you put the mass into it, that basically gives you the form, and then you test the form by putting the circulation into it, and when you know how you want to circulate through the form, you basically end up with a typology. And for us, typology is very kind of pivotal, but typology doesn't come first. Typology is the product of the process. Once we've got the typology, then we find the appropriate structure for the typology, and once we have the appropriate structure, then we look at a way to put the services in, and that can be in a Lewis Kahn way, as a sort of thick walls over here, or it could be in a courb way of a kind of free plan, or it could be in a museum way where you kind of put in a courb. Here we did a mixture. So I'm going to show you setting, mass and circulation, and I'm going to just run through how that works in this building. So this is the site. It's in the Dean's garden. It's the garages that used to belong to the Dean. At the back is a city wall, the Roman city wall. 1 million people walk along the city wall every year, and that number's increasing. So they were kind of keen that somehow this building was kind of seen. These were the existing garages here, and there was a garden here, and there's this garden wall here that goes up through the site was seen as being important to the planners. And this is a view from the city wall back, looking at the garage buildings here. And this garden here was basically the site where the brief said, put the workshop in the garden. That was what the brief said to do. The brief also said that you should put the apprentices in the attic. And but we observe that there's it's a gang nail structure. And actually, if you put the apprentices in, there's almost no room for them, because by the time you've insulated it, the space is fairly useless. So we said that's not really a kind of goer. So we then approached the site where we said we want to take clues from the site and use those clues from the site in making the site here. So here you can see the ramparts, and you can see how we wanted to lift our building. We were making a timber building. We want to lift our building out of the ground, because actually most timber buildings used to do that. They elevate themselves above the ground to protect themselves. And the other thing that timber buildings do is they project themselves outwards to protect their surface. So those are the two things we wanted to do. And our point was that actually you should put the workshop next to the city wall, and you should put the apprentices into the garden, because that way the apprentices gained some privacy, and the workshop gained great. It became a kind of display. That's what the city of York wanted. So here is in the book we show how our quests were to engage the precinct and work with a kind of idea of radial light and create a kind of community. And by going through the mass setting and typology, that's what we had. This is what they said we should do, and we said this is what you should do. So we kind of broke the rules of the competition and then won it. And we also said that actually the roof of the building should lift up towards the city wall, so that actually the people on the city wall could see the apprentices and the masons, and actually there's a sort of two-way street. And actually there's a constant queue of people just looking in now. And we said that that was really important, that there was this connection between the city wall, but we wanted that, like with the singing ringing tree too, and actually an experience Anna and I had in India where we heard a stonemason's yard, where they beat a drum and the masons all worked to the beating of a drum. The sound is really beautiful. So the sound of the stonemasons is quite fantastic. But the stonemasons, if the roof had just gone upwards like this, then they wouldn't be able to see the minster. And we felt they should always be able to see the minster. So the building lifts up towards the city wall. I'm going to show you that a little bit more in a minute. For circulation, there's a long track. So like a bishop's staff, it comes up and wheels round. And then the apprentices are to one side, the workshop's at the back, the administration is here, and then we separated out the vehicles over here and all the heavy machinery and the people. So we separated, so that in the centre we could kind of put nature. And then the typology, well, the quad represents kind of education, and in kind of mythology it represents kind of the earthly presence, but actually a circle represents spirituality and a circle represents community. So we put a circle over the square, and we did that by finding the appropriate structure. So I'm going to show you how we did that. And I mentioned about lifting it up to the wall and lifting it up to the cathedral. So those two simple moves. So here's the journey of typology, and these are all the variants we kind of went through when it was actually much more complicated than this. I've appreciated that in a way. And there's several months worth of work there, and actually all sorts of crazy things that didn't happen. And then we kind of get a building that lifts up towards the wall, and you can see how the building sort of radiates. So how did we do that? Well, we said we want to make a simple structure of a post, and a cantilevered beam that spans between the posts, and then can cantilever in to make the circle on the one side and cantilever out to protect the timber structure on the other side. So the beams are very simple, but they radiate around the plan, and that gives you the circle, and it lifts up. And it becomes a kind of hyperparaboloid just by lifting and dropping them. And so we made lots of models of how that could happen and different forms of that. And in the end, we decided the one with a straight at the end and the curve in the inside was the right one. And then we always have, like Anna showed you, the singing ringing tree, all of our projects, like the bent metal with the swing bridge, we always like to have one detail that actually makes it cost effective, and this is it. So you can buy on Screwfix back bracket, and we said that the load wants to go directly into the column. And so we said if you take the load directly into the column through the bracket can move up and down, the bracket can swivel, and the thing in the bracket can tilt. So you get an X, Y, Z for £6. That gives you this plan. We worked with Buckland Timber. They were great, and the roof is kind of radial all the way around, rising and falling until it gets on top of apprentices, where it becomes simple. So it becomes very quick to do. You put the bracket in, with the crane, they just drop the beam in, so they can actually do lots of them within a day. So it's a very fast and effective way of building it. So all of a sudden the form kind of appears, and then it's going over the existing structure. So this is the existing brick structure that then is stripped back, and then the loads are delivered back onto the brick structure. And you can see, I'm not going to show you that view again, but you're going to see how that roof actually undulates. So whenever in the building is always undulating, it's always moving, but the beams are always pointing towards the centre, towards the courtyard and towards nature, and we put nature in the centre of the courtyard. And then on top of that, we put plywood. So by putting the plywood in, we make a stress skin structure, and over the top of a hyperaboloid. So the first layer goes on, and it goes on with the direction of the beams. The second layer goes on in a different direction, and the third layer goes in a different direction like that. And as you glue them all together, as the beams are getting wider, you need more layers at the back because the span is 1.2, but in the middle you need less. So the plywood is distributed like that. And as the beams pass from inside to outside, and we called this for freeze, but actually it was keeping the beam warm as it passed through the kind of thermal layer. And the ceiling plan, so as I said in the cathedral you always look up, and actually I'd say I always like a ceiling plan. I think a ceiling plan is so underrated, but in this building it was actually very, very pivotal for us. So the ceiling plan is what we wanted the building to be about, and here you can see what you're looking at here is services. That's the Dean's garage, these are the plant rooms, these are the apprentice rooms, and that's other plant rooms there. But apart from that, you're just looking at a radial plan, and the services also radiate out, and they come from kind of thick walls. So, sort of, like I said, it's a sort of Khan notion, but here we have a kind of thick wall. So over in the admin block, there's a thick wall that deals with all the toilets for the staff behind, and here the apprentice is a thick wall where all the services run within the wall. They actually run within here, not within here, but they come down here and come to there. So, I mean, in the workshop, each apprentice has a cupboard, and that's the kind of service, and each apprentice has an extract fan, and that's the service. So each one is kind of given a cupboard. So I'll just show you the apprentice wing. So this is a section through the apprentice wing. So in the courtyard is going to have a thing called a lapidarium, where the remains that come off the cathedral are pinned to the wall, so it'll be a museum that will kind of grow over time. On the inside, they're plaster casts that the apprentices use, and then there's the thick wall. The thick wall with the services in serves a bathroom. The bathroom has a top light that becomes a lantern that serves the rest of the plan. And then there's the apprentice's bedroom. And then on the outside, the apprentice has a bench in his own gravel garden, and on here he has a bench where he can take off his boots and leave his dusty overalls on the outside. I say his, it's mainly women at the moment, apprentices. And this is the corridor, which leads to, and they go through the sort of thick wall there, those are the benches. And we wanted all of the circulation spaces to be kind of education spaces. So we wanted them to be spaces that were social spaces and spaces of learning. And the apprentices actually, at one point we had the apprentices kind of exposed like we did in the other wing, where you'll see where it's all glass. And one of the apprentices, Charlie, said, actually, we don't want people to see us, we'd rather be hidden, and that's why they kind of quite like being in the garden. So we actually left the existing garden wall where it was and let light in over the top, so a celestial light brings the evening light into this space. This is the apprentice's room with a lantern above the bathroom. The shower is obviously incredibly important when you're an apprentice and you come back kind of covered in dust. The shower is a very much sort of daily ritual, and at night it also becomes the lantern of the room, and that's all made of plywood, and then you can see the beams on the roof there and the sound protection. And then enclosure. Enclosure, sometimes the walls are the most important thing, and in this building here the structure is on the outside and the insulation is on the inside, so the structure is expressed. But the most important thing in this project was the roof, and the roof cantilevers out to the outside and cantilevers to the inside, but it all slopes towards the inside, so all of the rainwater is collected. And this side, the rainwater is collected simply and runs in a straight line across the apprentice rooms and down here, but on the other side where the master masons are, it comes round and does a loop underneath itself and comes into a tank. So these rainwater harvesting tanks feed the green space that's in the middle, which is a wildflower garden. So this is a standing seam roof, so this is a sort of aerial shot of the standing seam roof going in. This is how the standing seam works, so there's 300 millimetres of insulation that will fill that standing seam roof. And you can see here the relationship between why this is lifted up and how you get that relationship to the cathedral. And there's spent a long time choosing the right gold for the standing seam roof. And then in terms of the rainwater goods, so of course cathedrals have gargoyles, and actually we felt the rainwater goods here, that had to be a story about the celebration of rain, because we're talking about light a lot, but actually for us it's always not more than just light, it's also about sort of the other elements as well. And so the water here, our chalet structures taught us a lot about tailoring, so this was made incredibly cost effectively by one piece of steel that's just folded to make a shape and then has sides that are tailored and fitted onto it, so it gives you a spout that does that, it goes on underneath itself. So, and apparently when it rains they'll come and watch that. And then the apertures, well apertures, last night in the Le Corbusier lecture I showed Laterette, and if you have to see one building where the apertures of the building are the most amazing on earth, that's it probably. And but here I think what we try to do is every aperture just has to do the job it's meant to do. So the apertures towards the back, they lift up to get north light into the studio, and the ones underneath them there, they drop down into the wall to let the sound out, but also to put cool air on the face of the masons, because actually having sort of cool air when you're sort of covered with dust is important. And then I'll just show you a couple of those. So here we are. So this is the sort of reality of the workshop. These are called bankers, and they can be raised up and down. These are the mason's cupboards with the duct coming. This is the gantry that delivers the stone. Behind the gantry is hidden the LEV system, which extracts the air. And you can see all of those beams. Everyone can see everybody, and everyone can see the roof, and the roof all points to the centre. So symbolically, it's all pointing into the middle. So this is the cupboards, and here's the window that drops into the wall so that the people on the wall can hear the masons working. This is the shingle garden, so the apprentices can hear anyone approaching. They also have a bench, and they have a window, and they have a barn door, so they can open the barn door to kind of communicate with their colleagues. So here's a view into the apprentice room with the kind of barn door open. And also the window becomes a kind of bench, so the idea is a friend can sit on the bench, a friend can sit on the bed, and someone can sit on the chair. So they can, the rooms can, even though they're small and cell-like, they're slightly bigger than laterette cells, but they are slightly based on Mount Grace Priory, where the garden, and eventually we want that to be planted, the shingle garden. So I've tried to show you how breaking a building down into its fundamentals allows you to go into each part of that building and find a story within the building that's a sub-story of the whole. And if you think about a story, any film, you have a series of characters, and each character has an agenda. Each character has a role to play, and each of those characters has to have, in a good film, each character will have a very particular role to play. And that's the same in a building. So these just a couple of pictures to finish. The apprentices, actually these are apprentices, in the courtyard here. The courtyard's just starting to grow. It's only recently been finished, and the workshop in the summer the doors open, and you're seeing straight through the building, and you're seeing the city wall behind, so the people can look into the city wall. And at night, when everybody's gone, the apprentices have the courtyard to themselves. They have the garden, and the courtyard just belongs to them, so it also becomes a social space. But it's also a space, the courtyard, by having no vehicles in and by being a clean space, it's also where they're going to have fundraising events. And actually, the Dean's Garden is where they kind of used to hold those, and now they're going to kind of hold them in the courtyard. And this is where the lapidarium is going to kind of cover the walls. And that's another picture of it at night. That's the admin wing there, and it's surrounded by benches because we wanted it to be a kind of social space. So it's acting like a kind of quad and a cloister. And that's again at night. And there it is sort of during the day, before the greenery came up. And these are David Walensky's pictures we've just sort of got. This is kind of looking back at the cathedral. So Anna is just going to say a few words to sort of round off.
At the end of the book,
Look at that.
conclusion, glossary, because we're conscious that we've sort of invented a lot of our own jargons in a way. They range from storytelling techniques to architectural terms like the fundamentals, the family of parts. So there's a glossary and the conclusion, and I think it's worth saying that we've shown with the case studies built work in order to show the whole process, asking, looking, playing, and making. But we also use the process in competitions that we do, and this was a library and gallery competition we did in Taiwan. The initial asking and looking bit was thinking about these sort of miles of books that they gave us a quantity of books, quite a prosaic brief, and we literally thought, well, what's the ideal? Want to be able to walk from the park into a space where you could see all the books in one glance. So we pursue the ideal, so that's where you enter, and from here you can see all the books, but you also walk through the books to get to the other side, which is facing the park, and that's where you read, and it's nice and bright. So just to finish, I suppose there are quite a number of ideas in this book, and thinking about architecture not as a product but a process, and also why stories and why nature. I suppose for us, I think stories are incredibly powerful tools for imagining what doesn't yet exist, and I think that in a way, in a nutshell, that's what architects do. We have to somehow take our clients and our contractors and consultants into that realm of imagination, and stories are a great way to do that, and to have them input in the story as well all the way along the journey. I think it's super helpful. But also nature, if you drew, and personally we are incredibly inspired by nature, but I suppose other people might have different sources of inspiration, but I think if you drew your stories from nature, you can't go wrong. It's an incredibly powerful quarry of inspiration, and not only that, because of our advanced tools, we are firstly understanding nature so much more at a multitude of scales, and it's kind of quite mind-boggling and very humbling what we're learning about nature. We're just, we've only just scratched the surface. So we're entering, I feel, a new era of knowledge about nature. And secondly, our tools allow us to almost mimic the way nature works through this kind of iterative, adaptive process, whether it's in the design, but also in the fabrication, in systemizing and tailoring parts of our architecture. So we're going to finish there, and I think just maybe this idea of a creation myth. Each time we get a project, it's an opportunity to find that new creation myth, and that's by tapping into what it is now, what it was before, in its origin, and what it could be for the future. Thank you very much.
To see such fantastic work, to hear about kind of processes with such clarity, which then produce buildings of such variety, or structures, or constructions, and that inquisitiveness again and again, that economy of means again and again. Many of us had seen one of the early ones, but then to see that emerge in the building in York, it's wonderful. I've not seen that before. Can you explain? Was there a moment when the processes became that clear to you? Because obviously the book sets out a way of working, which, as I said at the beginning, few architects would be able to articulate. Few architects would even risk articulating something, and certainly just simply not be able to do it. And yet, 20 or so years into practice together, and a bit, now it obviously makes complete sense. But was there a kind of moment of epiphany?
I'm not sure there was.
It was a very slow epiphany.
The truth is, the first book that Mike showed was largely written by him. I helped a little bit. That was when we first met in Hong Kong. So there was a lot of post-rationalization of looking back at what Mike did in Hong Kong, which was working at speed and also working as an outsider, perhaps, which forced him to observe in a very acutely kind of intuitive way, and which I thought was interesting, and then having to work, economically and so on. So there was a lot of looking back and say, well, what happened here, and what did they do here, and trying to take that process all the way through as a kind of thought process. So that was the first attempt, and then we definitely use it a lot, sometimes more explicitly with the whole office, and sometimes more implicitly. If we didn't have time, Mike and I would try to do it in our heads, and certainly, I think what I tried to show, the words in the beginning, they do free you up from, I suppose, your architectural habits and prejudices.
because I was slightly faffing around when I said something about unique work, but it's so damn clear that it is unique. You know, in a way that other people's work is similar to other people's work. It doesn't really seem that.
I think it's unique.
It's not the case.
Hopefully, it's unique to itself because of the questioning process we go through. Hopefully, it's unique to
I think that uniqueness is, was when we first started practice in the UK, everything we did was different. And someone said to me, "Oh, everything you do is different. You're all over the place." And actually, that's because most people's work is actually very consistent or very similar. But for us, our first entry in the RIBA directory, it was very, very short. It said, "We only want to do what we've never done before." And Dominic Cullen pointed out to me that was the antithesis of being a professional. But it was a kind of artistic endeavour, but actually we wanted to start from first principles every time. So I think for a long time people didn't really understand why everything we did was different. But I hope this book makes it a little bit clearer why they're different.
The graphics in your book make it look like it's a computer program, that it's coded, and it, you know, makes it look like this is how you would teach a class to design. And if you follow these steps, everything that you showed tonight, if you follow these steps, you'll come up with something brilliant. But your work is much more intuitive than that. It's not AI. It's not artificially generated. It comes from years and years of crafting and caring.
Yeah.
Why did you choose that way of presenting your work? And because
it's down to the designer actually.
Yeah.
We said to him we wanted something that kind of looked like a kind of botanical manual or a taxonomy or a kind of evolutionary diagram. So I think the fact that, and he came up with the sort of pages of dots, and he said the way you think is the world is full of things, and then you pick them out and you take some of them forward, but not all of them. And I think that's what he was trying to show by the branching diagram. But the really important thing is you expand and you contract. You expand and you contract. So we wanted to kind of get that across in a kind of diagram that showed how that came backwards and forwards.
And I think halfway through we did try to explain that you're right. The times when we do teach this technique, it isn't just filling out a spreadsheet of, you know, those 3 pillars and 4 expansion. You then have to exercise your judgment as an architecture student or an architect. And this is where I think this idea of architectural literacy is incredibly important. How do you know when something's the right thing or is good? And that's not going to come out of filling out spreadsheets or, you know, doing this process. So it has to feed into that. And maybe it doesn't come across here, those kind of, you know, I suppose this is a diagram of, let's say, your thought process, but all the way through, as an architect, young or old, you have built up this intuitive knowledge, visiting buildings, studying buildings, for sure.
It is worth pointing out that somewhere on this diagram here, it says presidents, and what we do is we kind of try to find that archetype before we find a precedent, and then once we've found the precedent of, say, a radial building, then we'll go and look for all the radial buildings we can find, and actually we'll know a lot just because, you know, we're visiting. Last night was about Le Corbusier, and it was all about, you know, what we're learning from him. But actually, we've been travelling together for years, looking at architecture. So we don't mention president as the generator. We use president as the checker, president as the comparison. And then we said in the first book, when you find the president that's appropriate, then you have to leapfrog it.
And I think AI doesn't yet have architectural knowledge. It can eventually, and it can be.
And AI doesn't have an imagination, so we're safe for a while.
It might eventually, but you know.
I just want to say I think it was a lovely talk because it was actually curated and edited so well as a kind of short story of storytelling. So I thought that was great. I wonder, sort of swinging off what you just said, whether it's a methodology that is for you, you know, and there is the universality in it is for people maybe to take pieces and threads from it about how you tie things together. But I think a lifetime of practice working out, you know, a system of design that you've perfected to help you make your decisions along the journey. That is such a valuable thing. But I wonder if somebody else could take your methodology. I think they need to reflect and find their own storytelling method.
I think they could. We work with a lot of practices to do that, and also a lot of it is about using the stories to engage the client, the consultant, and the contractor believes in the story. And stories are transformative in that way. They are not bogged down in the sort of facts. It's about fiction.
But we've been teaching it in Bath University to the 5th years. They have 5th year and then they have 6th year. And when they come into 5th year from Bath's 4th year, they need kind of recalibrating, and when the people come in, they need to kind of rethink outside of the box. So we use it as a way of kind of getting them to think from first principles again. Yeah. And we've seen the success of that, and some people kind of get it and they're off, and other people, I think they're never going to get it. But architecture is a bit like that. So I think, all we can do is share it, and actually all we can do is say it's a very holistic process. And actually, if people do follow it, they don't need to follow all of it, because sometimes we don't follow all of it. So sometimes the clues, it's just encouraging people to kind of look into unusual places to find those clues. Because if you want to make something that's different to normal, you have to look in a different way.
John, you have to
Yeah, I guess I'm really interested in this because you used the word quest. Each one of those nodes is a quest, and there's something that prevails over the ones that fall away. And the port that we've seen tonight, I think it's scaling from the bridge and the stems up to the project at York Minster. So there's a certain scale of project that this is applied to. And then at the end, I think we saw it's called the Spiral Book Mountain?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, competition, and you also, I've seen some of the work you've done of that scale. So the question really is, how do you think this would scale up to probably buildings of a much larger scale or programmatic complexity? Is it possible to sustain that energy over many more quests or many more things, or how would you tailor that to suit a different kind of level of project you might be working towards?
I always said when I was a student that a good diagram will fit on a postage stamp.
Yeah.
And a building doesn't matter how big a building is, large or small. A diagram should still fit on a postage stamp. So.
And that's the archetype in a way.
Yeah.
It's we describe it as the sort of the key to the project. It sort of makes you relate to it. And I don't think scaling up is a cumulative process. You've got to zoom out and think of the whole thing as quite a simple and clear idea, and then you break it into the 8 components that Mike described. So it's not at all a problem.
It's still a holistic entity for us. We're not really about kind of eclecticism or the amalgamation of things being brought together. So a lot of architects, when they scale up, they just bring more different typologies into one thing. But actually, all of those big competitions we've done are generally just one big idea. And
I think that's the beauty of the story, because stories have to be clear and have a kind of overarching idea, and obviously things unfold, but it has to have a sort of strong ethos.
So it's more about how you, I guess, tailor the explorations and the questions and the quests.
Yeah.
You keep them relatively narrow, and they expand and they contract, rather than expanding the field of inquiry.
Yes, I think so. And also, I think the design alternative thing, I don't know if that really came across, but we always do 4. I was saying to students, so many students would just do 1, saying, no, you've got to do 3 more. And they're like, so I'm going to sit with you till you at least come up with 2 more, and then you've got to come up with a 4th, you know, because if you don't, you're not challenging yourself and you're not challenging the brief, and by the time you've got those 4 alternatives, it usually becomes really obvious which one is best. You know, and that's where the kind of quest thing comes. It's like a story, there's a sort of conflict and a battle and a resolution, and it's quite often the things sort of amalgamate together to make a really tight diagram, but because we're not into eclecticism, because we're into kind of singularity, that diagram always gets stronger by the addition of things and getting rid of what's not necessary.
Almost like a distillation, I think, by using the story to help you do that.
I always used to say that if you can get on the phone and explain to your grandmother a project on the phone and she gets it, you've won the competition.
And send her the postage stamp.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, actually, in your last answer, you touched on it a little bit, because you're talking a lot about storytelling, but you're not talking about it in terms of ideas, but it is actually ideas, and how you actually have good ideas is actually very informed by your process and your analytical thinking about the separate elements. That's what I'm understanding.
Yeah.
So you could frame it as ideas, but I'm interested that you use the word storytelling, because that's much more imaginative and it pulls people in. Is that why you're more attracted to the idea of storytelling than ideas?
Because it feels, yeah, I think that means,
There's a hierarchy,
stories,
so you can say this, but when you have a feeling, that's a notion. When you have an idea, that's a series of notions joined together. When you're drawing a series of ideas together, that's a concept. And when a concept works on many levels, that's a story. So I think a story is a greater thing than an idea.
it works on so many more levels, right?
Yes.
Sorry, it's a very small one, but I really love the fact that you bring in all the senses, and that for me is inspirational, because I've always been very frustrated as an architect, because quite often people negate to think about sound, the beauty of the sound, the stonemasons, etc., the wind, and bringing this to life. I think it is actually something that you can capture with a story, which you don't get with a film, because a film is purely visual. You can suggest it through the imagery. You can actually feel the sensations, which is something I feel very powerful in architecture, and I'm delighted that you capture it so well.
I suppose in a way the kind of industrial era is about keeping things out, keeping sound and the messiness of nature out. But actually, if we can kind of reconnect it to it much more actively and much more, I suppose, proactively, could be much more interesting. You then become more aware of the passage of time and so on.
And I think your observation is good, because a lot of people say, well, what is the story? And we say, well, actually, when people go to our buildings, they have no idea what story we use to generate it. But the singing ringing tree has become incredibly popular. If I meet anyone from Burnley and they know we designed the singing ringing tree, they're like, oh, everybody knows it, and it's had 8 million hits on YouTube. And it's because it's an experience. Because when someone came all the way from Australia doing a PhD on music, and he went to the singing ringing tree, and we looked at the forecast and thought, yeah, you're safe to go, and it didn't make a noise. He had to leave before it made a noise. But in Burnley, that's not a problem, because you just go back the next day, or the next day, So it's the fact that actually the experience, the story is an experience, is what makes it memorable. And actually that's how we experience architecture, just kind of somehow architecture gets in the way.
Okay, well, that's not a question, hardly. Anna, Mike, thank you so much. There's two things that just, it seems that I've taught, many people in this room have taught, and one of the things that obviously you see is students not start at the beginning and trying to get to the end really quick, not knowing how on earth to get from, and so the idea of iteration is something which is difficult to gain confidence in, and your methodology gives people something to breathe into, to kind of, it seems like an incredibly valuable teaching tool. The other thing you said earlier about the person said that when you're in the architecture, the young architects, oh, that doesn't sound very professional or whatever. I think this is an exemplary example of practice or praxis, the idea of taking theory and turning it into practice, the application of practical knowledge. And there is both uniqueness and consistency. There's a consistency of thinking and a uniqueness of things come from it. So thank you very much for sharing that.
So we're very lucky to work with Liu and Mike on the book, and we have it for sale tonight for a special price of £23, and you don't need to check Amazon because I already did. So if anyone would like a copy,
Please stay around for a drink.